our featured work is Hamlet by Shakespeare. First, let us consider a few points that will enrich the listening experience. Hamlet, written by William Shakespeare around 1600, is one of the most renowned tragedies in English literature. Set in Denmark, it explores themes of revenge, madness, morality, and the complexity of human emotion. The play's rich poetic language and profound philosophical questions about life and death have captivated audiences for centuries. Listening to Hamlet offers an immersive experience, combining elevated Elizabethan drama with intense psychological insight. Now, let the story begin. Gertrude, Queen of Denmark, becoming a widow by the sudden death of King Hamlet, in less than 2 months after his death, married his brother Claudius, which was noted by all people at the time for a strange act of indiscretion. Or unfeelingness, or worse. For Claudius did in no way resemble her late husband in the qualities of his person or his mind, but was as contemptible in outward appearance as he was base and unworthy in disposition. And suspicions did not fail to arise in the minds of some that he had privately made away with his brother, the late king, with the view of marrying his widow and ascending the throne of Denmark, to the exclusion of young Hamlet, the son of the buried king, and lawful successor to the throne. But upon no one did this unadvised action of the queen make such an impression as upon this young prince, who loved and venerated the memory of his dead father almost to idolatry, and being of a nice sense of honor, and a most exquisite practicer of propriety himself, did sorely take to heart this unworthy conduct of his mother Gertrude. Insomuch that, between grief for his father's death and shame for his mother's marriage, this young prince was overclouded with a deep melancholy, and lost all his mirth and all his good looks. All his customary pleasure in books forsook him. His princely exercises and sports, proper to his youth, were no longer acceptable. He grew weary of the world, which seemed to him an unweeded garden, where all the wholesome flowers were choked up, and nothing but weeds could thrive. Not that the prospect of exclusion from the throne, his lawful inheritance, weighed so much upon his spirits, though that, to a young and high-minded prince, was a bitter wound and a sore indignity. But what so galled him, and took away all his cheerful spirits, was that his mother had shown herself so forgetful to his father's memory, and such a father, who had been to her so loving and so gentle a husband. Then she had always appeared as loving and obedient a wife to him, and would hang upon him as if her affection grew to him. And now, within 2 months, or as it seemed to young Hamlet, less than 2 months, she had married again, married his uncle, her dear husband's brother, in itself a highly improper and unlawful marriage because of the nearness of relationship, but made much more so by the indecent haste with which it was concluded, and the unkingly character of the man whom she had chosen to be the partner of her throne and bed. This it was which, more than the loss of 10 kingdoms, dashed the spirits and brought a cloud over the mind of this honorable young prince. In vain was all that his mother Gertrude or the king could do to contrive to divert him. He still appeared in court in a suit of deep black, as mourning for the king his father's death, which mode of dress he had never laid aside, not even in compliment to his mother upon the day she was married. nor could he be brought to join in any of the festivities or rejoicings of that, as appeared to him, disgraceful day. What mostly troubled him was an uncertainty about the manner of his father's death. It was given out by Claudius that a serpent had stung him. But young Hamlet had shrewd suspicions that Claudius himself was the serpent. In plain English, that he had murdered him for his crown, and that the serpent who stung his father did now sit on the throne. How far he was right in this conjecture, and what he ought to think of his mother, how far she was privy to this murder, and whether by her consent or knowledge, or without it came to pass, were the doubts which continually harassed and distracted him. A rumor had reached the ear of young Hamlet that an apparition exactly resembling the dead king his father had been seen by the soldiers upon watch on the platform before the palace at midnight for 2 or 3 nights successively. The figure came constantly clad in the same suit of armor from head to foot which the dead king was known to have worn. And they who saw it, Hamlet's bosom friend Horatio was one, agreed in their testimony as to the time and manner of its appearance, that it came just as the clock struck 12. That it looked pale, with a face more of sorrow than of anger. That its beard was grisly, and the color a sable silvered, as they had seen it in his lifetime. That it made no answer when they spoke to it. Yet once they thought it lifted up its head and addressed itself to motion, as if it were about to speak. But in that moment the morning cock crew, and it shrunk in haste away, and vanished out of their sight. The young prince, strangely amazed at their relation, which was too consistent and agreeing with itself to disbelieve, concluded that it was his father's ghost which they had seen, and determined to take his watch with the soldiers that night, that he might have a chance of seeing it. For he reasoned with himself that such an appearance did not come for nothing, but that the ghost had something to impart, and though it had been silent hitherto, yet it would speak to him. And he waited with impatience for the coming of night. When night came, he took his stand with Horatio and Marcellus, one of the guard, upon the platform where this apparition was accustomed to walk. And it being a cold night, and the air unusually raw and nipping, Hamlet and Horatio and their companion fell into some talk about the coldness of the night, which was suddenly broken off by Horatio announcing that the ghost was coming. At the sight of his father's spirit, Hamlet was struck with a sudden surprise and fear. He at first called upon the angels and heavenly ministers to defend them, for he knew not whether it were a good spirit or bad, whether it came for good or evil. But he gradually assumed more courage. And his father, as it seemed to him, looked upon him so piteously, and as it were desiring to have conversation with him, and did in all respects appear so like himself as he was when he lived, that Hamlet could not help addressing him. He called him by his name, Hamlet, King, Father, and conjured him that he would tell the reason why he had left his grave, where they had seen him quietly bestowed, to come again and visit the earth and the moonlight, and besought him that he would let them know if there was anything which they could do to give peace to his spirit. And the ghost beckoned to Hamlet that he should go with him to some more removed place where they might be alone. and Horatio and Marcellus would have dissuaded the young prince from following it, for they feared lest it should be some evil spirit who would tempt him to the neighboring sea or to the top of some dreadful cliff, and there put on some horrible shape which might deprive the prince of his reason. But their counsels and entreaties could not alter Hamlet's determination, who cared too little about life to fear the losing of it. And as to his soul, he said, what could the spirit do to that, being a thing immortal as itself? And he felt as hardy as a lion, and bursting from them, who did all they could to hold him, he followed whithersoever the spirit led him. And when they were alone together, the spirit broke silence, and told him that he was the ghost of Hamlet, his father, who had been cruelly murdered, and he told the manner of it. That it was done by his own brother, Claudius, Hamlet's uncle, as Hamlet had already but too much suspected, for the hope of succeeding to his bed and crown. That, as he was sleeping in his garden, his treasonous brother stole upon him in his sleep, and poured the juice of poisonous henbane into his ears, which has such an antipathy to the life of man, that swift as quicksilver, it courses through all the veins of the body, baking up the blood, and spreading a crust-like leprosy all over the skin. Thus sleeping, by a brother's hand, he was cut off at once from his crown, his queen, and his life. And he adjured Hamlet, if he did ever his dear father love, that he would revenge his foul murder. And the ghost lamented to his son that his mother should so fall off from virtue as to prove false to the wedded love of her first husband, and to marry his murderer. But he cautioned Hamlet, howsoever he proceeded in his revenge against his wicked uncle, by no means to act any violence against the person of his mother, but to leave her to heaven and to the stings and thorns of conscience. And Hamlet promised to observe the ghost's direction in all things, and the ghost vanished. And when Hamlet was left alone, he took up a solemn resolution that all he had in his memory, all that he had ever learned by books or observation, should be instantly forgotten by him, and nothing live in his brain but the memory of what the ghost had told him and enjoined him to do. And Hamlet related the particulars of the conversation which had passed to none but his dear friend Horatio. And he enjoined both to him and Marcellus the strictest secrecy as to what they had seen that night. The terror which the sight of the ghost had left upon the senses of Hamlet, he being weak and dispirited before, almost unhinged his mind and drove him beside his reason. And he, fearing that it would continue to have this effect, which might subject him to observation, and set his uncle upon his guard if he suspected that he was meditating anything against him, or that Hamlet really knew more of his father's death than he professed, took up a strange resolution from that time to counterfeit as if he were really and truly mad, thinking that he would be less an object of suspicion when his uncle should believe him incapable of any serious project, and that his real perturbation of mind would be best covered and pass concealed under a disguise of pretended lunacy. From this time Hamlet affected a certain wildness and strangeness in his apparel, his speech, and behavior, and did so excellently counterfeit the madman that the king and queen were both deceived, and not thinking his grief for his father's death a sufficient cause to produce such a distemper. For they knew not of the appearance of the ghost, they concluded that his malady was love, and they thought they had found out the object. Before Hamlet fell into the melancholy way which has been related, he had dearly loved a fair maid called Ophelia, the daughter of Polonius, the king's chief counselor in affairs of state. He had sent her letters and rings, and made many tenders of his affection to her, and importuned her with love in honorable fashion, and she had given belief to his vows and importunities. But the melancholy which he fell into latterly had made him neglect her, and from the time he conceived the project of counterfeiting madness, he affected to treat her with unkindness and a sort of rudeness. But she, good lady, rather than reproach him with being false to her, persuaded herself that it was nothing but the disease in his mind, and no settled unkindness which had made him less observant of her than formerly. And she compared the faculties of his once noble mind and excellent understanding, impaired as they were with the deep melancholy that oppressed him, to sweet bells, which in themselves are capable of most exquisite music, but when jangled out of tune or rudely handled, produce only a harsh and unpleasing sound. Though the rough business which Hamlet had in hand, the revenging of his father's death upon his murderer, did not suit with the playful state of courtship, or admit of the society of so idle a passion as love now seemed to him, yet it could not hinder but that soft thoughts of his Ophelia would come between, and in one of these moments, when he thought that his treatment of this gentle lady had been unreasonably harsh, he wrote her a letter full of wild starts of passion, and in extravagant terms, such as agreed with his supposed madness, but mixed with some gentle touches of affection, which could not but show to this honored lady that a deep love for her yet lay at the bottom of his heart. He bade her to doubt the stars were fire, and to doubt that the sun did move, to doubt truth to be a liar, but never to doubt that he loved, with more of such extravagant phrases. This letter Ophelia dutifully showed to her father, and the old man thought himself bound to communicate it to the king and queen, who from that time supposed that the true cause of Hamlet's madness was love. And the queen wished that the good beauties of Ophelia might be the happy cause of his wildness, for so she hoped that her virtues might happily restore him to his accustomed way again. To both their honors. But Hamlet's malady lay deeper than she supposed, or than could be so cured. His father's ghost, which he had seen, still haunted his imagination, and the sacred injunction to revenge his murder gave him no rest till it was accomplished. Every hour of delay seemed to him a sin and a violation of his father's commands. Yet how to compass the death of the king, surrounded as he constantly was with his guards, was no easy matter. Or, if it had been, the presence of the queen, Hamlet's mother, who was generally with the king, was a restraint upon his purpose, which he could not break through. Besides, the very circumstance that the usurper was his mother's husband filled him with some remorse, and still blunted the edge of his purpose. The mere act of putting a fellow creature to death was in itself odious and terrible to a disposition naturally so gentle as Hamlet's was. His very melancholy, and the dejection of spirits he had so long been in, produced an irresoluteness and wavering of purpose which kept him from proceeding to extremities. Moreover, he could not help having some scruples upon his mind, whether the spirit which he had seen was indeed his father, or whether it might not be the devil, who he had heard has power to take any form he pleases. and who might have assumed his father's shape only to take advantage of his weakness and his melancholy to drive him to the doing of so desperate an act as murder. And he determined that he would have more certain grounds to go upon than a vision or apparition, which might be a delusion. While he was in this irresolute mind, there came to the court certain players in whom Hamlet formerly used to take delight, and particularly to hear one of them speak a tragical speech, describing the death of old Priam, king of Troy, with the grief of Hecuba, his queen. Hamlet welcomed his old friends, the players, and remembering how that speech had formerly given him pleasure, requested the player to repeat it, which he did in so lively a manner, setting forth the cruel murder of the feeble old king, with the destruction of his people and city by fire, and the mad grief of the old queen, running barefoot up and down the palace, with a poor clout upon that head where a crown had been, and with nothing but a blanket upon her loins, snatched up in haste, where she had worn a royal robe, that not only it drew tears from all that stood by, who thought they saw the real scene, so lively was it represented, but even the player himself delivered it with a broken voice and real tears. This put Hamlet upon thinking, if that player could so work himself up to passion by a mere fictitious speech, to weep for one that he had never seen. For Hecuba, that had been dead so many 100 years, how dull was he, who, having a real motive and cue for passion, a real king and a dear father murdered, was yet so little moved. That his revenge all this while had seemed to have slept in dull and muddy forgetfulness. And while he meditated on actors and acting, and the powerful effects which a good play, represented to the life, has upon the spectator, he remembered the instance of some murderer, who, seeing a murder on the stage, was by the mere force of the scene and resemblance of circumstances so affected that on the spot he confessed the crime which he had committed. And he determined that these players should play something like the murder of his father before his uncle, and he would watch narrowly what effect it might have upon him. And from his looks he would be able to gather with more certainty if he were the murderer or not. To this effect he ordered a play to be prepared, to the representation of which he invited the king and queen. The story of the play was of a murder done in Vienna upon a duke. The duke's name was Gonzago, his wife Baptista. The play showed how one Lucianus, a near relation to the duke, poisoned him in his garden for his estate, and how the murderer in a short time after got the love of Gonzago's wife. At the representation of this play, the king, who did not know the trap which was laid for him, was present, with his queen and the whole court. Hamlet, sitting attentively near him to observe his looks. The play began with a conversation between Gonzago and his wife, in which the lady made many protestations of love, and of never marrying a second husband if she should outlive Gonzago, wishing she might be accursed if she ever took a second husband, and adding that no woman did so but those wicked women who kill their first husbands. Hamlet observed the king his uncle change color at this expression, and that it was as bad as wormwood both to him and to the queen. But when Lucianus, according to the story, came to poison Gonzago sleeping in the garden, the strong resemblance which it bore to his own wicked act upon the late king, his brother, whom he had poisoned in his garden, so struck upon the conscience of this usurper that he was unable to sit out the rest of the play, but on a sudden, calling for lights to his chamber. And affecting or partly feeling a sudden sickness, he abruptly left the theater. The king being departed, the play was given over. Now Hamlet had seen enough to be satisfied that the words of the ghost were true and no illusion. And in a fit of gaiety, like that which comes over a man who suddenly has some great doubt or scruple resolved, he swore to Horatio that he would take the ghost's word for 1,000 pounds. But before he could make up his resolution as to what measures of revenge he should take, now he was certainly informed that his uncle was his father's murderer, he was sent for by the queen, his mother, to a private conference in her closet. It was by desire of the king that the queen sent for Hamlet, that she might signify to her son how much his late behavior had displeased them both, and the king wishing to know all that passed at that conference, and thinking that the too partial report of a mother might let slip some part of Hamlet's words, which it might much import the king to know, Polonius, the old counselor of state, was ordered to plant himself behind the hangings in the queen's closet, where he might unseen hear all that passed. This artifice was particularly adapted to the disposition of Polonius, who was a man grown old in crooked maxims and policies of state, and delighted to get at the knowledge of matters in an indirect and cunning way. Hamlet being come to his mother, she began to tax him in the roundest way with his actions and behavior, and she told him that he had given great offense to his father, meaning the king, his uncle, whom, because he had married her, she called Hamlet's father. Hamlet, sorely indignant that she should give so dear and honored a name as father, seemed to him, to a wretch who was indeed no better than the murderer of his true father, with some sharpness replied, "Mother, you have much offended my father." The queen said that was but an idle answer. "As good as the question deserved," said Hamlet. The queen asked him if he had forgotten who it was he was speaking to. "Alas," replied Hamlet, "I wish I could forget. You are the queen, your husband's brother's wife, and you are my mother. I wish you were not what you are." "Nay, then," said the queen, "if you show me so little respect, I will set those to you that can speak," and was going to send the king or Polonius to him. But Hamlet would not let her go, now he had her alone, till he had tried if his words could not bring her to some sense of her wicked life. And taking her by the wrist, he held her fast and made her sit down. She, affrighted at his earnest manner, and fearful lest in his lunacy he should do her a mischief, cried out, and a voice was heard from behind the hangings, "Help! Help! The queen!" Which Hamlet hearing, and verily thinking that it was the king himself there concealed, he drew his sword and stabbed at the place where the voice came from, as he would have stabbed a rat that ran there. Till the voice ceasing, he concluded the person to be dead. But when he dragged for the body, it was not the king, but Polonius, the old officious counselor, that had planted himself as a spy behind the hangings. "Oh me!" exclaimed the queen, "what a rash and bloody deed have you done!" "A bloody deed, mother," replied Hamlet, "but not so bad as yours, who killed a king and married his brother." Hamlet had gone too far to leave off here. He was now in the humor to speak plainly to his mother, and he pursued it. And though the faults of parents are to be tenderly treated by their children, yet in the case of great crimes, the son may have leave to speak, even to his own mother, with some harshness. So, as that harshness is meant for her good, and to turn her from her wicked ways, and not done for the purpose of upbraiding. And now this virtuous prince did in moving terms represent to the queen the heinousness of her offense, in being so forgetful of the dead king, his father, as in so short a space of time to marry with his brother and reputed murderer. Such an act as, after the vows which she had sworn to her first husband, was enough to make all vows of women suspected, and all virtue to be accounted hypocrisy, wedding contracts to be less than gamesters' oaths, and religion to be a mockery and a mere form of words. He said she had done such a deed that the heavens blushed at it, and the earth was sick of her because of it. And he showed her 2 pictures, the one of the late king, her first husband, and the other of the present king, her second husband, and he bade her mark the difference. What a grace was on the brow of his father! How like a god he looked! The curls of Apollo, the forehead of Jupiter, the eye of Mars, and a posture like to Mercury, nearly alighted on some heaven-kissing hill. This man, he said, had been her husband. And then he showed her whom she had got in his stead, how like a blight or a mildew he looked, for so he had blasted his wholesome brother. And the queen was sore ashamed that he should so turn her eyes inward upon her soul, which she now saw so black and deformed. And he asked her how she could continue to live with this man and be a wife to him, who had murdered her first husband and got the crown by as false means as a thief. And just as he spoke, the ghost of his father, such as he was in his lifetime, and such as he had lately seen it, entered the room, and Hamlet, in great terror, asked what it would have. And the ghost said that it came to remind him of the revenge he had promised, which Hamlet seemed to have forgot. And the ghost bade him speak to his mother, for the grief and terror she was in would else kill her. It then vanished, and was seen by none but Hamlet, neither could he by pointing to where it stood, or by any description, make his mother perceive it, who was terribly frightened all this while to hear him conversing, as it seemed to her, with nothing. And she imputed it to the disorder of his mind. But Hamlet begged her not to flatter her wicked soul in such a manner as to think that it was his madness, and not her own offenses, which had brought his father's spirit again on the earth. And he bade her feel his pulse, how temperately it beat, not like a madman's. And he begged of her with tears to confess herself to heaven for what was past, and for the future to avoid the company of the king, and be no more as a wife to him. And when she should show herself a mother to him, by respecting his father's memory, he would ask a blessing of her as a son. And she, promising to observe his directions, the conference ended. And now Hamlet was at leisure to consider who it was that in his unfortunate rashness he had killed. And when he came to see that it was Polonius, the father of the lady Ophelia, whom he so dearly loved, he drew apart the dead body. And, his spirits being now a little quieter, he wept for what he had done. The unfortunate death of Polonius gave the king a pretense for sending Hamlet out of the kingdom. He would willingly have put him to death, fearing him as dangerous, but he dreaded the people, who loved Hamlet, and the queen, who, with all her faults, doted upon the prince, her son. So this subtle king, under the pretense of providing for Hamlet's safety, that he might not be called to account for Polonius' death, caused him to be conveyed on board a ship bound for England. Under the care of 2 courtiers, by whom he dispatched letters to the English court, which in that time was in subjection and paid tribute to Denmark, requiring for special reasons, there pretended, that Hamlet should be put to death as soon as he landed on English ground. Hamlet, suspecting some treachery, in the night time secretly got at the letters, and skillfully erasing his own name, he, in the stead of it, put in the names of those 2 courtiers who had the charge of him. To be put to death. Then, sealing up the letters, he put them into their place again. Soon after, the ship was attacked by pirates, and a sea fight commenced, in the course of which Hamlet, desirous to show his valor, with sword in hand, singly boarded the enemy's vessel, while his own ship, in a cowardly manner, bore away, and leaving him to his fate, the 2 courtiers made the best of their way to England, charged with those letters, the sense of which Hamlet had altered to their own deserved destruction. The pirates, who had the prince in their power, showed themselves gentle enemies, and knowing whom they had got prisoner, in the hope that the prince might do them a good turn at court in recompense for any favor they might show him, they set Hamlet on shore at the nearest port in Denmark. From that place, Hamlet wrote to the king, acquainting him with the strange chance which had brought him back to his own country, and saying that on the next day he should present himself before his majesty. When he got home, a sad spectacle offered itself the first thing to his eyes. This was the funeral of the young and beautiful Ophelia, his once dear mistress. The wits of this young lady had begun to turn ever since her poor father's death. That he should die a violent death, and by the hands of the prince whom she loved, so affected this tender young maid that in a little time she grew perfectly distracted, and would go about giving flowers away to the ladies of the court, and saying that they were for her father's burial, singing songs about love and about death, and sometimes such as had no meaning at all, as if she had no memory of what happened to her. There was a willow which grew slanting over a brook, and reflected its leaves on the stream. To this brook she came one day when she was unwatched, with garlands she had been making, mixed up of daisies and nettles, flowers and weeds together, and clambering up to hang her garland upon the boughs of the willow, a bough broke, and precipitated this fair young maid, garland and all that she had gathered, into the water, where her clothes bore her up for a while, during which she chanted scraps of old tunes, like one insensible to her own distress, or as if she were a creature natural to that element. But long it was not before her garments, heavy with the wet, pulled her in from her melodious singing to a muddy and miserable death. It was the funeral of this fair maid which her brother Laertes was celebrating, the king and queen and whole court being present, when Hamlet arrived. He knew not what all this show imported, but stood on one side, not inclining to interrupt the ceremony. He saw the flowers strewed upon her grave, as the custom was in maiden burials, which the queen herself threw in. And as she threw them, she said, "Sweets to the sweet. I thought to have decked thy bride bed, sweet maid, not to have strewed thy grave. Thou shouldst have been my Hamlet's wife. And he heard her brother wish that violets might spring from her grave. And he saw him leap into the grave, all frantic with grief, and bid the attendants pile mountains of earth upon him, that he might be buried with her. And Hamlet's love for this fair maid came back to him, and he could not bear that a brother should show so much transport of grief. For he thought that he loved Ophelia better than 40,000 brothers. Then, discovering himself, he leaped into the grave where Laertes was, all as frantic or more frantic than he. And Laertes, knowing him to be Hamlet, who had been the cause of his father's and his sister's death, grappled him by the throat as an enemy, till the attendants parted them. And Hamlet, after the funeral, excused his hasty act in throwing himself into the grave, as if to brave Laertes. But he said he could not bear that anyone should seem to outgo him in grief for the death of the fair Ophelia. And for the time, these two noble youths seemed reconciled. But out of the grief and anger of Laertes for the death of his father and Ophelia, the king, Hamlet's wicked uncle, contrived destruction for Hamlet. He set on Laertes, under cover of peace and reconciliation, to challenge Hamlet to a friendly trial of skill at fencing, which Hamlet accepting, a day was appointed to try the match. At this match, all the court was present, and Laertes, by direction of the king, prepared a poisoned weapon. Upon this match, great wagers were laid by the courtiers, as both Hamlet and Laertes were known to excel at this sword play. And Hamlet, taking up the foils, chose one, not at all suspecting the treachery of Laertes, or being careful to examine Laertes' weapon, who, instead of a foil, or blunted sword, which the laws of fencing require, made use of one with a point, and poisoned. At first, Laertes did but play with Hamlet, and suffered him to gain some advantages, which the dissembling king magnified and extolled beyond measure, drinking to Hamlet's success, and wagering rich bets upon the issue. But after a few passes, Laertes, growing warm, made a deadly thrust at Hamlet with his poisoned weapon, and gave him a mortal blow. Hamlet, incensed, but not knowing the whole of the treachery, in the scuffle exchanged his own innocent weapon for Laertes' deadly one. And with a thrust of Laertes' own sword, repaid Laertes home, who was thus justly caught in his own treachery. In this instant, the queen shrieked out that she was poisoned. She had inadvertently drunk out of a bowl which the king had prepared for Hamlet, in case that being warm in fencing he should call for drunk. Into this the treacherous king had infused a deadly poison, to make sure of Hamlet if Laertes had failed. He had forgotten to warn the queen of the bowl, which she drank of, and immediately died, exclaiming with her last breath that she was poisoned. Hamlet, suspecting some treachery, ordered the doors to be shut, while he sought it out. Laertes told him to seek no farther, for he was the traitor, and feeling his life go away with the wound which Hamlet had given him, he made confession of the treachery he had used. And now he had fallen a victim to it. And he told Hamlet of the envenomed point, and said that Hamlet had not half an hour to live, for no medicine could cure him. And begging forgiveness of Hamlet, he died, with his last words accusing the king of being the contriver of the mischief. When Hamlet saw his end draw near, there being yet some venom left upon the sword, he suddenly turned upon his false uncle and thrust the point of it to his heart, fulfilling the promise which he had made to his father's spirit, whose injunction was now accomplished. And his foul murder revenged upon the murderer. Then Hamlet, feeling his breath fail and life departing, turned to his dear friend Horatio, who had been spectator of this fatal tragedy, and with his dying breath requested him that he would live to tell his story to the world, for Horatio had made a motion as if he would slay himself to accompany the prince in death. And Horatio promised that he would make a true report, as one that was privy to all the circumstances. And thus satisfied, the noble heart of Hamlet cracked, and Horatio and the bystanders, with many tears, commended the spirit of this sweet prince to the guardianship of angels. For Hamlet was a loving and a gentle prince, and greatly beloved for his many noble and prince-like qualities, and if he had lived, would no doubt have proved a most royal and complete king to Denmark. The reading is followed by a deeper literary commentary. Hamlet stands as one of Shakespeare's most enigmatic and profound works, encapsulating the complexity of human consciousness, the intricacies of language, and the deep ambivalence that characterizes the human condition. Harold Bloom's perspective frames Hamlet as a poem unlimited, a text so saturated with personal and existential inquiry that it transcends conventional narrative constraints to function as a limitless exploration of identity, morality, and artistic creation. This limitless nature of Hamlet invites infinite interpretations. Positioning the protagonist as not merely a character in a moral drama, but as a universal emblem of the intellectual and emotional struggles that define modern subjectivity. The character of Hamlet, more than any other in Shakespeare's oeuvre, appears to embody the tension between action and reflection, presence and absence, reality and illusion. Underscoring Shakespeare's unparalleled ability to dramatize the complexity of human thought and feeling. Stephen Greenblatt's biographical and cultural contextualization further enriches our understanding of Hamlet's genesis, illustrating how Shakespeare's life within the vibrant Elizabethan world shaped the contours of his characters and themes. Greenblatt reveals that Hamlet, as a play, emerges from the convergence of Renaissance humanism, familial dynastic anxieties, political turbulence, and the cultural fascination with revenge tragedy, all of which coalesce in Shakespeare's creation to produce a work profoundly engaged with the uncertainties and vicissitudes of existence. This historical embeddedness does not diminish Hamlet's universality. Rather, it anchors its philosophical inquiries in the unpredictable, often contradictory milieu of Shakespeare's own world, where questions of authority, legitimacy, and human fallibility played out in both political and personal arenas. The interpretive challenges posed by Hamlet are well delineated in E. D. Hirsch, Jr. Snarsh's work, which addresses the fundamental hermeneutic difficulties in stabilizing the meaning of Shakespeare's texts. Hamlet's manifold layers of meaning resist fixed interpretation because they engage readers in a complex, interactive process where historical, linguistic, and cultural contexts intersect with subjective responses. Hirsch argues that to fully appreciate Hamlet, one must acknowledge the multiplicity of its meanings as a feature rather than a flaw. Recognizing Shakespeare's strategic deployment of ambiguity and equivocation to mirror the instability of human experience itself. This perspective aligns closely with the critical tradition that views Hamlet not as a puzzle awaiting a definitive key, but as a living text that continuously renews its relevance and poignancy with each act of reading. Or performance. This ongoing renewal is evident in the vast body of critical work represented by Kiernan Ryan's compilation of new essays, which attests to the play's enduring capacity to inspire varied critical inquiries and reinterpretations. Ryan's collection reflects the dynamic and evolving nature of Hamlet scholarship, demonstrating how contemporary critical methodologies, from psychoanalytic to sociopolitical to performance studies, can open new vistas on Shakespeare's dense and multidimensional text. Each essay contributes to a richer, more nuanced appreciation of Hamlet's thematic concerns, including madness, mortality, political corruption, and the complicated dynamics of familial relationships, thus reaffirming the play's place as a central site of modern literary and philosophical reflection. Leah Price's examination of Shakespearean allusion in contemporary literature further confirms Hamlet's extraordinary cultural endurance and its capacity to resonate across eras. Price highlights how Hamlet's imagery, language, and thematic complexity circulate widely throughout modern and postmodern literary works, often serving as a touchstone for writers grappling with the legacy of Shakespeare's genius. This continuous dialogic relationship between Hamlet and subsequent literature exemplifies Shakespeare's impact beyond the stage, revealing how his works function as a foundational text in the Western literary canon and as an inexhaustible source of creative inspiration. The ability of Hamlet to be recontextualized and to assume new meanings in varied literary and cultural frameworks speaks to Shakespeare's profound understanding of language's polyvalence and the human psyche's inexhaustible depths. Crucially, this capacity for allusion underscores the symbiotic relationship between Shakespeare's texts and the interpretive communities that engage with them, highlighting the collaborative nature of meaning-making that spans centuries. At the interstice of these interpretive perspectives lies a recognition of Shakespeare, and particularly Hamlet, as a nexus of artistic innovation and intellectual inquiry. Shakespeare's mastery lies in his profound psychological insight and linguistic dexterity, which allow him to create characters and situations that resist simplistic moral resolution, instead inviting sustained reflection on the ambiguities of human motivation and ethical decision-making. Hamlet's famed soliloquies, with their philosophical questioning and linguistic playfulness, illustrate Shakespeare's ability to render the interiority of thought with unprecedented depth and complexity. Such soliloquies not only enhance dramatic tension, but also act as vehicles for exploring the tensions between individual agency and external constraint, between thought and action. This exploration anticipates many of the central preoccupations of modern drama and philosophy, effectively positioning Shakespeare as a precursor to later existentialist and psychoanalytic thought. Moreover, the play's structural and thematic complexity is inseparable from the historical conditions of its creation, as Greenblatt's work demonstrates. suggesting that Shakespeare's artistic achievements are inseparable from his acute responsiveness to the political and social realities of his time. Thus, Hamlet embodies the intertwining of historical specificity and universal significance that makes Shakespeare's work enduringly compelling. In conclusion, Hamlet stands as a testament to Shakespeare's unparalleled ability to weave together the personal and the political, the philosophical and the theatrical, the linguistic and the psychological. Through this play, Shakespeare not only transforms a familiar revenge tragedy into an exquisite meditation on the human condition, but also establishes a literary legacy that continues to challenge, inspire, and provoke scholarly and artistic engagement. The interpretive richness of Hamlet reflects both Shakespeare's artistic genius and the complex cultural matrix from which the play emerged, ensuring that it remains a living text, continually reinterpreted and reimagined across generations. Shakespeare's Hamlet is thus both a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature and a prism refracting endless facets of meaning. An enduring masterpiece whose infinite depths affirm the timeless power of Shakespeare's literary genius. Shakespeare's Hamlet evolves from a tale of political intrigue into a profound exploration of the human psyche and the moral ambiguities surrounding justice and vengeance. At its core, the play grapples with the disruption of natural and social order through the murder of King Hamlet and the usurpation of his throne by Claudius, his brother. The narrative unfolds primarily through Hamlet, the grieving prince, whose internal conflict forms the emotional and intellectual backbone of the drama. Hamlet's initial devastation stems not only from his father's death, but more acutely from the abrupt remarriage of his mother, Gertrude, to Claudius. This event induces in Hamlet a deep melancholy and disillusionment with the world, which he describes as an unweeded garden where corruption chokes the natural beauty of life. His grief is compounded by his suspicion, later confirmed, that Claudius is the murderer. This suspicion is catalyzed by the apparition of his father's ghost, which introduces the supernatural and emphasizes the theme of unsettled accounts and vengeance. The ghost scene is pivotal, establishing Hamlet's quest and introducing one of the play's central tensions, the conflict between action and contemplation. Hamlet's promise to avenge his father is immediately beset by doubt and philosophical reflection. Shakespeare masterfully depicts Hamlet's introspection and moral quandaries, which distinguish him from a typical revenge hero. Hamlet's soliloquies, especially the to be or not to be meditation, unravel the torment of a man caught between ethical responsibilities and the paralysis of intellect. His hesitation reflects an existential crisis rather than mere cowardice. The decision to feign madness marks a critical strategic and thematic development. By adopting this disguise, Hamlet navigates a court rife with intrigue and surveillance, concealing his knowledge while probing Claudius's guilt. The motif of appearance versus reality permeates the play, manifesting in Hamlet's madness, the staged play within a play, and the duplicity of Claudius. This motif questions the reliability of perception and challenges the characters and the audience to discern truth beneath surfaces. Among the most striking characters is Ophelia, whose tragic trajectory mirrors and contrasts Hamlet's. Her initial innocence and devotion succumb to the brutal forces of court politics and personal grief. Ophelia's madness, wrought by her father Polonius's death and Hamlet's erratic behavior, culminates in her death, an ambiguous event between accident and suicide. Ophelia's plight highlights the limited agency of women within the patriarchal environment of the play and evokes Shakespeare's sensitive portrayal of grief and mental collapse. The political dimension of Hamlet intertwines with personal tragedy. Claudius embodies corruption and ambition, juxtaposed with Hamlet's introspective nobility. The court's atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal serves as the backdrop to individual dramas, from Polonius's machinations to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern's betrayal. Shakespeare critiques the moral decay of rulership and justice through Claudius's reign, emphasizing the cost of power gained through treachery. The play within a play, The Murder of Gonzago, serves as a theatrical metaphor and narrative device to confirm Claudius's guilt. Hamlet's manipulation of performance to evoke a reaction from Claudius epitomizes the theme of artifice as a mirror of truth. This meta-theatrical moment underscores the power of drama to reveal concealed realities and catalyze moral reckoning. The suspense and drama escalate with Hamlet's killing of Polonius, an impulsive act that triggers a chain of tragic events. This moment underscores the unintended consequences of revenge and Hamlet's tragic flaws, his volatility, and his entanglement with his own hesitations. Polonius's death accelerates the conflict, resulting in Hamlet's exile to England and further confrontations upon his return. Opposing Hamlet is Laertes, whose decisive and fiery nature contrasts Hamlet's hesitance. Laertes' grief for his father and sister drives him to seek immediate vengeance, illustrating an alternative approach to justice, action without moral entanglement. Yet his willingness to engage in treachery by accepting Claudius's poisoned weapon highlights the pervasive corruption of the court. The climactic duel symbolizes the culmination of the entangled fates of the main characters, bringing tragedy to a deadly conclusion. The sword fight brings not only physical confrontation, but also moral consequences, and reveals the extent of Claudius's machinations. The accidental poisoning of Gertrude marks the tragic cost of political and familial corruption, weakening the royal lineage further. Hamlet's final acts of killing Claudius and entrusting Horatio with his story embody the tragic hero's fulfillment of his vows and the passing of legacy. The manner of Hamlet's death, noble, remorseful, yet satisfied, encapsulates the play's meditation on death, honor, and the cyclical nature of violence. His last charge to Horatio reflects Shakespeare's concern with memory and history, ensuring that truth survives amid the ruins of tragedy. Stylistically, Shakespeare's Hamlet is a masterpiece of poetic language, ranging from lofty philosophical soliloquies to sharp political dialogues and emotional confrontations. The play's intricate characterizations reveal depths of human psyche unavailable in earlier Renaissance drama. Hamlet's complexity as a brooding intellectual, torn between thought and action, prefigures modern psychological drama. In his vacillation and existential questioning, Hamlet becomes a universal figure, embodying the human condition's contradictions. The play also explores themes such as mortality and the afterlife, the nature of madness, both feigned and real, and the interplay between fate and free will. Through Hamlet's lens, Shakespeare probes questions of identity and the ethical limits of revenge. The repeated imagery of decay, the rottenness in the state of Denmark, the skull of Yorick, functions as a memento mori, reminding the audience of the inevitability of death and the futility of earthly pursuits. Moreover, Hamlet engages with familial and social bonds, particularly the tension between filial duty and personal morality. Hamlet's relationship with Gertrude is complex, fraught with disappointment and love, while his interactions with Ophelia embody the possibility and fragility of romantic relationships amid turmoil. The concept of loyalty is repeatedly tested, with friends turned into spies and confidants forced into betrayal. In conclusion, Hamlet stands not simply as a revenge tragedy, but as a profound exploration of the human condition. Shakespeare's nuanced portrayal of its characters and themes invites audiences to reflect on the moral ambiguities of justice, the nature of existence, and how individuals navigate a corrupt world. The play's enduring power lies in its ability to blend political intrigue, psychological depth, and poetic beauty into a timeless narrative that continues to resonate across cultures and eras. Importantly, Hamlet also embodies a skillful interrogation of language itself as a tool of power, deception, and revelation. The characters often wield rhetoric as weapons or shields, with Hamlet's own clever use of puns, double meanings, and ironic speech exposing Claudius's duplicity and unsettling the court's equilibrium. Shakespeare's linguistic dexterity elevates dialogue beyond mere communication, transforming it into a battleground where truth is contested and identity constructed. This manipulation of language foregrounds the play's preoccupation with the elusive nature of meaning and the instability of appearances, reinforcing the thematic tension between essence and facade. In parallel, the motif of surveillance infiltrates the play's narrative structure, reflecting the heightened atmosphere of paranoia within the Danish court. Characters are watched and are watchers themselves, as seen with Polonius's spying, Claudius's use of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as informants, and Hamlet's own scrutiny of others. This pervasive gaze fosters a climate of distrust and anxiety, illustrating the erosion of privacy and authenticity in power structures built on suspicion. The theme resonates with broader socio-political concerns about governance and control, suggesting that autocratic regimes breed environments where genuine human connection deteriorates, replaced by performative interactions steeped in calculation and fear. The complexity of Hamlet's psychological state further invites psychoanalytic interpretation, positioning the play as a precursor to modern explorations of trauma, repression, and identity fragmentation. His oscillation between fury, melancholy, contemplative withdrawal, and feigned madness reflects multifaceted human responses to loss and injustice. The Oedipal theories, famously drawn from Hamlet's intense fixation on Gertrude, though controversial, underscore the depth of familial and unconscious tensions simmering beneath the surface. This dimension enriches the drama's textual fabric, inviting readers to unravel layers of subtext concerning desire, rivalry, and the unconscious drives that compel human behavior. Moreover, Shakespeare's treatment of death extends beyond its physical finality to encompass the philosophical and spiritual uncertainties that haunt human existence. Hamlet's reflections on mortality transcend mere acceptance, engaging with metaphysical questions about what lies beyond life and whether the soul endures in any meaningful sense. The ghost's ambiguous origin and purpose raise questions about the afterlife's nature and the legitimacy of supernatural intervention in human affairs. These uncertainties contribute to Hamlet's hesitation and moral wrestling, highlighting the discomfort that comes with confronting unknown realms and the limitations of human knowledge. The interplay of gender roles in Hamlet offers a critical lens through which to examine the constraints and expectations imposed on individuals by societal norms. Gertrude's remarriage provokes Hamlet's ire, not simply because of political implications, but also because of the perceived betrayal of feminine loyalty and chastity. Ophelia's descent into madness and ultimate death implicitly critique a patriarchal system that renders women vulnerable to oppression and silenced in their grief and agency. Shakespeare subtly challenges contemporary attitudes by portraying female characters who, although limited by their circumstances, possess emotional complexity and whose fates reveal the tragic consequences of male power struggles. In addition, the symbolic imagery utilized throughout the play functions as a rich tapestry underpinning thematic concerns. The recurring references to disease and decay, the something rotten in the state of Denmark, the imagery of blackness, and references to poison, conjure a vision of a world infected by corruption, both moral and political. These images underscore the interconnectedness of personal failings and societal collapse, suggesting that the health of the kingdom reflects the virtue of its rulers. Such symbolism serves to enhance the dramatic tension and imbues the narrative with layers of allegorical meaning. Furthermore, Hamlet complicates traditional notions of justice by exposing the paradoxes inherent in revenge. Hamlet's pursuit of vengeance for his father's murder is fraught with ethical dilemmas, questioning whether retaliation can restore order or merely perpetuate cycles of violence. Let us now examine the work through its primary analytical perspective. William Shakespeare's Hamlet stands as a monumental work in the culture and intellect of the Western canon, deeply embedded in the humanistic concerns and symbolic complexity of its age and ours. Crafted in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Hamlet reflects not only the Renaissance preoccupation with humanism, but also explores universal questions of morality, identity, power, and the human condition. It is a work that vibrantly stages the struggle between reason and emotion, life and death, action and inaction. Issues central to the intellectual and cultural framework of Shakespeare's time, and valuable through the modern lens. At the core of Hamlet lies the cultural tension inherent in the transition from medieval notions of divine order, fate, and hierarchy to a Renaissance emphasis on individual agency, subjectivity, and skepticism. The play's protagonist, Prince Hamlet, embodies this transition. Hamlet's melancholia and philosophical rumination serve as the intellectual battleground where humanist ideals of self-reflection and reason confront the darker realities of existential uncertainty and political corruption. His famous soliloquies, deeply embedded with reflections on mortality, to be or not to be, the nature of existence, and the meaning of life. Position the character as a prototype of introspective modernity, grappling with personal and existential dilemmas that transcend his historical setting. Symbolically, Hamlet employs a rich array of motifs to explore the ethical and social decay of Denmark's ruling class. The motif of disease and corruption, manifested through imagery of an unweeded garden, poisoned crowns, and decay, serves as a metaphor for the erosion of legitimate authority and moral order. Claudius, the usurping uncle and regicide, is not merely a villain, but a symbol of political corruption that disturbs the natural and social order. Hamlet's quest for revenge is more than personal. It is a symbolic expedition into restoring balance and justice in a world thrown into moral chaos. The ghost of the dead king functions as a spectral symbol of unresolved history and the haunting presence of conscience, bridging the past and present. Its message compels Hamlet to act, imposing a moral imperative that challenges Renaissance humanism to reconcile notions of justice, revenge, and divine will. Humanistically, the play probes deeply into the nature of human relationships and individual psyche. Hamlet's fraught relationship with his mother Gertrude reflects themes of loyalty, betrayal, and the complexities of familial duty and affection. Gertrude's swift remarriage provokes Hamlet's disgust and reflects anxieties about female agency, chastity, and moral judgment in Elizabethan society. The tension between Hamlet and Ophelia introduces the vulnerability of love and the destructive impact of political and familial machinations. Ophelia's descent into madness and death presents a tragic counterpoint to Hamlet's internal turmoil, making visible the human cost of the corruption and violence at court. Culturally, Hamlet also engages with contemporary intellectual currents, such as the questioning of absolute monarchies, the justice of revenge, and the nature of legitimate authority embedded within the political upheavals of the time. Hamlet's hesitation and introspection contrast with the decisive and often brutal acts common in revenge tragedies. Reflecting Renaissance skepticism about violence and the consequences of unchecked power. His philosophical nature introduces doubt and moral complexity into a narrative that might otherwise be a straightforward tale of vengeance. The play's depiction of political intrigue, espionage, and manipulation, seen in figures like Polonius and Claudius, echoes contemporary concerns about governance, surveillance, and loyalty. The ghost's ambiguous nature further compels reflection on spiritual and theological beliefs of Elizabethan England, marked by anxieties about purgatory, the afterlife, and the efficacy of earthly justice. The ghost's injunction that Hamlet should not harm his mother suggests a complex ethical code, one that demands revenge but also restraint. Underscoring the tension between human justice and divine morality. Intellectually, Hamlet showcases an extraordinary narrative layering, no mere linear revenge tragedy, but a deeply self-reflexive work interrogating theater itself. Hamlet's use of the play within the play as a device to catch the conscience of Claudius by mirroring his crime represents a meta-theatrical exploration of illusion and reality, performance and truth. Imagination and action. This device underscores the intellectual engagement with questions of appearance versus reality, a persistent theme in Renaissance literature and philosophy. Ultimately, Hamlet's cultural and humanistic resonance comes from its vivid portrayal of a protagonist confronted by a fractured world. It merges tragedy with philosophical meditation on the tragic human condition. Hamlet is emblematic of the tension between idealism and pragmatism, thought and action, despair and hope. The universal human issues he faces, grief, betrayal, love, existential doubt, transcend the political and temporal setting of the play, enabling it to remain a crucial vehicle for exploring what it means to be human. Moreover, the linguistic craftsmanship of Hamlet intricately enhances its cultural and intellectual depth. Shakespeare's mastery of the English language not only bolsters thematic complexity, but also imbues the play with layers of meaning that resonate differently across contexts and epochs. The often ambiguous phrasing and rich wordplay allow multiple interpretations, encouraging audiences and readers to engage in active meaning-making rather than passively consuming a fixed narrative. For instance, Hamlet's oscillation between eloquence and fragmented speech reflects his psychological turmoil and intellectual wrestling, inviting a nuanced understanding of his internal conflict rather than reducing him to a mere archetype of indecision. The play's exploration of temporality and memory further enriches its humanistic inquiry. Hamlet is obsessed not just with avenging his father's death, but with the ways in which the past persists in the present, shaping identity and action. The ghost symbolizes this temporal tension, haunting Hamlet and compelling him to navigate the slippery terrain between remembrance and forgetting, history and immediacy. Shakespeare presents memory as both a source of motivation and a heavy burden, revealing how the past's unresolved traumas can immobilize or galvanize. Echoing Renaissance debates about history's moral and political function. In terms of dramatic structure, Hamlet's intricately layered plot and its self-aware theatricality challenge conventional genre boundaries. It blends elements of tragedy, revenge drama, dark comedy, and philosophical discourse, resisting closure and definitive resolution to mirror the complexity of lived experience. The play's open-endedness, particularly reflected in Hamlet's final moments, invites reflection rather than cathartic release, enhancing its philosophical gravitas and ensuring its perennial relevance. This refusal to sanction straightforward moral judgments or neat endings disrupts Elizabethan expectations and anticipates modernist sensibilities about ambiguity and fragmentation. The psychological realism of Hamlet also merits further attention. Shakespeare does not present Hamlet's madness as a mere plot device, but rather as a multifaceted condition reflecting the tension between sanity and insanity, truth and illusion. A second perspective reveals further dimensions of the work. From the vantage point of aesthetics, Hamlet is an exquisite exemplification of the artistic power of form, style, and imagery to evoke sensory and emotional experiences that deepen the thematic core of the play. The structure, language, and poetic devices Shakespeare employs generate a dense and rich artistic tapestry, celebrated for its beauty and psychological depth. The play's form straddles genres, combining elements of tragedy, history, revenge drama, and philosophical discourse. Shakespeare's masterful use of soliloquy, especially Hamlet's, breaks the dramatic fourth wall to immerse the audience in the prince's inner world, making his intellectual and emotional processes a central spectacle. The soliloquies themselves are notable for their rhythmic and rhetorical sophistication, blending iambic pentameter with variations in cadence, metaphor, and sound that mirror Hamlet's vacillating moods. The rhythm carries the audience through his despair, irony, sarcasm, and introspection with unequaled vitality. Imagery in Hamlet is layered and vivid, often drawing from the natural world, the body, and the supernatural to engage the senses and imagination simultaneously. Views of decay and corruption, rotten to the core, an unweeded garden choked with weeds, images of poison, the juice of poisonous henbane, and visual contrasts between the regal appearance of the deceased king and the unsightly Claudius serve to create a visual texture filled with tension and symbolic meaning. The recurring motifs of disease and pestilence are not only metaphoric, but evoke a visceral, almost physical unease for the audience, aligning the sickness of the state with that of the body and soul. The style oscillates between the poetic and the prosaic, in harmony with changes in tone and context. Shakespeare's mastery of language is manifest in the delivery of complex philosophical ideas through piercingly concise and poetic expressions, while shifts to prose reveal intimacy, madness, or court intrigue. This dynamic language use enhances the artistic experience by engaging different affects, eloquence and grandeur on one hand, the grotesque and the cynical on the other. The sensory effects of the play are further heightened by its imaginative use of the supernatural and the theatrical. The ghost's eerie appearances, described with great atmospheric detail, evoke a chilling effect that carries beyond mere horror to something deeply unsettling in its interruption of natural order. The interplay of light and darkness, silence and speech, visible and invisible, conjures a haunting spectacle. The auditory imagery of the morning cock's crow dispelling the ghost serves as a metaphoric ringing of spiritual and temporal boundaries. The artistic experience of Hamlet culminates in a powerful emotional catharsis wrought through tension and release. The emotional palette ranges from the intense sorrow of loss to the bitter irony of human folly, from ecstatic love to paralyzing despair. The weaving of tragic elements with moments of black humor, irony, and theatricality guides the audience through a roller coaster of affective experiences, all finely calibrated through Shakespeare's dramatic construction and linguistic artistry. The play within the play device also contributes a meta-artistic aesthetic dimension, inviting audiences to reflect on the nature of art itself as a mirror of reality and an instrument of truth. This invention layers the experience of attending a play with additional self-awareness, enriching the audience's engagement with the narrative and its meanings. Considerations of beauty in Hamlet are complex and multifaceted. The beauty of the deceased king's noble visage contrasts sharply with the ugliness of moral corruption embodied by Claudius, showing how external form and internal essence conflict. Finally, here are several companion works worth reading. Readers and scholars interested in Hamlet will find insightful connections in several related novels that explore shared themes of revenge, morality, human introspection, and political intrigue. One vital companion is Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Like Hamlet, Dostoevsky's protagonist Raskolnikov grapples with the moral consequences of murder, guilt, and redemption. Both characters reflect a psychologically complex response to tragic events and ethical dilemmas surrounding justice and conscience. The narrative depth in Dostoevsky's novel, with its existential questioning, inner turmoil, and exploration of morality, provides a modern philosophical counterpart to Hamlet's Renaissance reflections. Another illuminating work is Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which, while philosophical rather than narrative, delves deeply into themes of self-overcoming, the death of traditional values, and the creation of new moral frameworks. Themes implicit in Hamlet's wrestling with established order and personal destiny. Nietzsche's critique of morality and focus on individual agency opens a dialogue with Hamlet's hesitations and his challenges to inherited moral codes. From the sphere of English literature, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness shares Hamlet's exploration of human nature and the darkness lurking within political and personal realms. Both texts use atmosphere and psychological insight to reveal corruption, madness, and the destructive effects of power. Conrad's prose style and symbolic use of light and darkness parallel Shakespeare's visual imagery and thematic concerns. Lastly, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein echoes Hamlet's tragic engagement with questions of human creation, responsibility, and alienation. The monster's existential isolation and quest for justice resonate with Hamlet's own alienation from the corrupt world around him. Both works critically investigate the boundaries between humanity and monstrosity, reason and passion, creator and created. Together, these works complement Hamlet by enriching our understanding of the intellectual, moral, and artistic questions Shakespeare's tragedy raises. Questions that remain profoundly relevant to human experience across cultures and eras.